History as it happens, February 29th, 2024. Who was Alexei Navalny?
Russia's prison authorities have announced that the leading Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny has died. A statement online said...
Make no mistake, Putin is responsible for Navalny's death. Putin is responsible. What has happened to Navalny is yet more proof of Putin's brutality.
Will be punished for what they have done with our country, with my family, and with my husband.
Russia's most prominent and effective opposition leader, anti-corruption crusader, and democratic politician. Alexei Navalny is dead at 47. But he leaves a legacy, setting an example of how to challenge the regime even while under constant state persecution. In Putin's Russia, his ordeal was not unique. That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
It's becoming a familiar sight. President Putin's nemesis on trial.
Huge nationwide demonstrations and police crackdowns. More than 5,000 people were arrested.
There are over 600 political prisoners in Russia. There's hope that, as devastating as the killing of Navalny has been, that the attention that it has brought about creates a small window to try to get some people out.
Most Americans were not very familiar with the name Alexei Navalny before 2020. That was the year Russian security agents poisoned him with a Soviet-era nerve agent that nearly killed him. And most people may not have even heard his voice until Navalny and his team released this video upon his fateful return to Russia in 2021. It's been viewed more than 130 million times on YouTube. It's called Putin's Palace.
И это расследование мы придумали еще, когда я находился в реанимации. Но сразу договорились о том, что выпустим мы его.
We came up with this investigation when I was in intensive care, but we immediately agreed that we would release it when I returned home to Russia, to Moscow, said Navalny, because we do not want the main character of this film to think we're afraid of him and that I will tell his worst secret while abroad. Well, that secret was an enormous property on the Black Sea coast, said to be used by Vladimir Putin as his personal palace, a setting of astonishing opulence, a symbol of kleptocracy and corruption if there ever were one. Navalny was arrested in early 2021, provoking some of the largest demonstrations of popular anger during Putin's more than 20 years in power. And now Alexei Navalny is dead. And as I speak into this microphone, what happened to him inside that Arctic penal colony isn't entirely clear. Whether he died of disease or, as some unconfirmed reports suggest, he was murdered on Putin's orders. Navalny's career in activism and politics began around the same time Putin became president, a time when optimism that Russia would flower into a democracy was on the wane after the excessively optimistic 1990s. Democracy on the march, the end of history, as Fukuyama put it. So who was this man? What did he stand for? And what does his case, his ordeal, one of hundreds involving political persecution, tell us about late Putinism, an authoritarian state that tolerates no dissent as it wages aggressive war in Ukraine? Miriam Lanskoy is Senior Director for Russia and Eurasia at the National Endowment for Democracy. She is an expert on Russia, its social and political problems, as well as democracy promotion and civil society in that region of the world. Miriam Lanskoy, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
So let's start with your assessment of reports that Navalny was killed, that Putin had Navalny killed, to prevent him from possibly being included in a prisoner swap for a Russian hitman who's imprisoned in Germany.
There have been several newspapers that have gotten confirmation from sources in the German government and in the U.S. government saying that there were such discussions. The claims that were made by Maria Pievchik, who's one of the top people in the organization that Navalny had created, she was saying that a trade was imminent, that they were in the final stages and that there was, literally he could be sitting with us now. if not for the killing. The clarifications that came from unnamed U.S. officials was, yes, there were discussions, but that's a little bit of an exaggeration. It's clear that there were conversations about a potential trade that would involve Krasikov, who's a GRU assassin in jail in Germany. Putin has made it clear on a number of different occasions, most recently in his interview with Tucker Carlson, that he is quite anxious to get him out and that he wants to see a deal done. What we don't know and what has never been kind of publicly disclosed is to what degree Germany and the US, what the details of that might be. But it's quite clear that such discussions were going on. We don't have a solid picture of what happened to Navalny. What I can say is that the people who are promising to chase this down and find out, they're quite good at this. It's Christo Groza from Bellingcat and other Russian investigative journalists who have remarkable sources and creative ability to get at information through all kinds of indirect ways. And they, Christo came out the first day and said, I will find out.
Okay.
The Anti-Corruption Foundation is promising rewards for information. This is a matter of pride for Russian journalists right now.
I was going to say, regardless what happened here, the regime is, of course, ultimately responsible for his death. Years of imprisonment in terrible conditions. He was up above the Arctic Circle, poisoning him in 2020, etc. He was sickly as a result of all of this. But if he were murdered, why now? We may not know. It's hard to tell what's going on.
I don't really know. There are a number of theories out there. There's a really good piece, actually, by Ilya Yashin, who's another political prisoner, who's saying that this is Putin's election campaign. It's not enough to not permit him to run, he repeatedly tried to register political parties. He repeatedly tried just to compete politically. It's not enough to put him in solitary confinement above the Arctic Circle. But in this pre-election moment for Putin, this isn't completely rational. You have to show that he can't exist at all. So what Yashin wrote, and it's, again, remarkable courage, one of the themes that I'd like to raise with you is that Navalny is not alone as a powerful personality who speaks out even in these conditions. Yashin is another liberal democratic oppositionist who is in jail. He had a 9-year sentence for speaking out against Bucha. So that after they killed Navalny, Yashin is saying, this is how Putin runs an election. I don't really know. Of course, all of us, from President Biden down to the Russian community and everyone considers Putin ultimately responsible.
Yeah, it is conjecture, just like why did he decide to invade Ukraine when he did rather than in 2014 when Ukraine was weaker? When did he give the order to do the full-scale war? We just don't know. There's no evidence there. But in the past, Putin had not mention Navalny by name in his public commentary, pretend that he doesn't exist, in other words.
Yes, it's to marginalize him and pretend that he's just not there as a force. And that, of course, has been a Kremlin line that Navalny and other Democrats, there's no demand for them in Russian public opinion. They just don't matter. So that's why you don't say his name.
The USSR was infamous for the Gulag. What is the extent of Russia's penal system today when it comes to political prisoners? You had mentioned to me in an email earlier that someone else today, as we were preparing to record this podcast, was in prison for 2.5 years, a prominent political dissident. Of course, we know the Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan, former U.S. Marine. They've been imprisoned in Russia for quite a while now. What can you tell us about that?
Thank you, Martin, so much for this opportunity to speak a little bit about political prisoners. So today, Oleg Orlov, who is the chairman of Memorial, this is Russia's oldest human rights organization. It was the first NGO registered in the Soviet Union, still under Gorbachev. It was headed up by Andrei Sakharov, who's a towering figure. He's a Nobel Prize winner and kind of a symbol of defending human rights. So Oleg Orlov is a similar type of figure. He's an icon of the Russian human rights movement. he was given many opportunities to leave. He wrote articles in which he said that Russia is becoming fascist, in which he said, don't look for fascists in Ukraine, look for them in the Kremlin. And the government kept saying, we're going to open a case against you, like maybe you'd like to leave. And he kept doubling down and not leaving and refusing to leave. So, of course, Alexei Navalny had come back. Oleg Orlov articulated clear positions against the war, against what was happening in Russia. They kept extending, we'll try you in 3 months. Okay, we'll try you in another 3 months. And today he was given a 2.5-year sentence, and he spoke again as Yashin, who's been in prison for a couple of years, as Navalny. Oleg Orlov spoke beautifully. He had a closing statement that I think has been widely translated and reprinted, in which he said, this is part of this return to the Soviet past. And not only do I stand by things I wrote back then, but everything we've seen since, including the killing. And he also repeated, standing in a court in Moscow, looking at a prison sentence for himself, he repeated that he considers Putin responsible for killing Navalny. These people have a remarkable courage. It's by far more than just one person. There are over 600 political prisoners in Russia. There's hope that, as devastating as the killing of Navalny has been, that the attention that it has brought about creates a small window to try to get some people out. And the ones that are being mentioned are people who have particular health conditions, that there could be a trade or some kind of leverage, whether it's a trade or not, that could release people who, I'll just mention a couple, Vladimir Putin. First of all, he's been in jail for almost 2 years. He's another outspoken critic of the regime. He's very prominent in DC. He was part of lobbying for the Magnitsky Act, both the sanctions in the US as well as global Magnitsky. He also went back to Russia after the war had started, spoke out against the war from Moscow, and now has a 25-year sentence. And he was subject to 2 poisonings and is in terrible health due to those poisonings, due to prison conditions. Navalny was held in isolation and it's called a shizo. It's a tiny concrete box. He was held something like, I have the exact number, he was held 27 times for 295 days. So that's like a third of his time in jail. It's a box that doesn't have any windows, that's extremely cold. This is severe, severe punishment.
Yeah, it's torture.
It's torture. People are denied food. People are deprived of sleep. These are fairly typical things. And I just want to mention a couple of others who have serious health issues that people are most concerned about. It's Sasha Skachilenko, Igor Baryshnikov, and he has cancer. So people can't get the kind of treatment that they need when they're in prison. Alexei Garinov, he has a lung disease. He was a local deputy in St. Petersburg who protested the war. He has serious lung conditions that are not being treated. So if there's a moment now where people are thinking about political prisoners and how to help them and how to put their cases more prominently, we should be looking for ways to do that.
Well, how much pressure or influence can outside countries exert here? It would seem very difficult for, say, the United States to have any leverage here to get any of these people released. I was just thinking back as you were speaking there to the Reagan administration, which did work to try to get political prisoners free during the late Soviet period.
Reagan administration and administrations prior to that, this was deliberate part of our diplomatic efforts. And you would combine meetings, summits, so forth with release of prisoners. So this was a track. I don't want to say it doesn't exist now. There's an Office of Hostage Affairs that negotiates releases. There's ongoing diplomacy. But what I think is really different now is there could be more engagement from U.S. civil society and from global civil society, letter writing campaigns, more media. I'm glad that there's so much coverage of Navalny's case. But like a persistent drumbeat of you will be asked about these cases. Wherever you go, you'll be asked about them. And that high-level engagement will entail having to talk about political prisoners. So Russia might be extremely difficult, where we don't ourselves have that much leverage, and we kind of have to go through Europeans or others to try to make that happen. Actually, everywhere in the region, there's been an incredible increase in political prisoners across the board. But Azerbaijan especially, there's anti-corruption investigators. There's 6 new cases, and one of them, Dr. Gupadi Batoglu, is in very serious condition. And there's fears he has a heart condition, he has a diabetic condition, and there's a fear that he might die in prison as well.
Yeah, well, you know, these names you've been mentioning here, I think to your point, most people have never heard of these people.
I've never heard of them.
Yeah, because
and
you
I
just don't
haven't
hear a lot
talked about the
this.
Americans, actually. Yeah. Paul Whelan has been there since 2018.
Evan Gershkovich, the journalist. Yeah.
Evan Gershkovich, almost a year now. There are 2 others, actually, who are dual citizens. There's Alsu Kurmasheva, who is an RFE-RL journalist. And just now, Ksenia Karelina, a ballerina, U.S.-Russia dual citizens.
Yeah, thinking back to Reagan's time during the Danilov affair, President Reagan actually mentioned it during a speech at the UN, and leverage was available because Gorbachev wanted the summit in Reykjavik, Iceland.
Recently, after the arrest of a Soviet national and UN employee accused of espionage in the United States, an American correspondent in Moscow was made the subject of fabricated accusations and trumped-up charges. He was arrested and jailed in a callous disregard of due process and numerous human rights conventions. In effect, he was taken as a hostage, even threatened with the death penalty. Both individuals have now been remanded to their respective ambassadors. But this is only an interim step agreed to by the United States for humanitarian reasons. It does not change the facts of the case. Gennady Zakharov is an accused spy who would stand trial. Nicholas Danilov is an innocent hostage who should be released. The Soviet Union bears the responsibility for the consequences of its action.
So Nick Danilov is actually a really good friend.
Oh, wow.
And it took a lot. It didn't magically happen. There was a lot of work on the part of Americans and some of the Russians who were also helping the family there to elevate the case.
Yeah, and it is difficult, even though on the other side, the person is being held for totally trumped-up charges. It's not fair, but life isn't fair. I do want to talk about Navalny, his life and legacy, but another question about Russia right now. How does dissent manifest, or how does it operate? It's not like people can go out on the street corner and hand out pamphlets and speak through a megaphone and expect to be left alone.
So Russia it's been changing very rapidly, especially over the last 2 years. Since the 90s, there were always registered opposition parties. Maybe they were manipulated to some degree, but the principle that there's opposition media, that there's a free internet until fairly recently. So they took control, or the Russian government took control of television. They understood the threat from television. That happened like in 2000. But the internet, up until, 5-6 years ago, was very free. So people are used to, you can form NGOs, you can form media. Much of the Russian investigative media, sort of these incredible stories of Putin's castle and many, many others, are all published on the internet, are all YouTube creatures, are all social media creatures. That's being blocked. That is changing very, very rapidly. So people don't know, like none of us know what's allowed, what's forbidden. Of course, legally, according to the Constitution, you have all kinds of rights. And this question of what makes you a dissident? What makes you a dissident is when you stand up for the notion that you have formal rights under the law, as opposed to the government has informal rules under which you can kind of participate in one way or not another. That's the essence of being a dissident.
As Michael Kimmage has pointed out here several times, Russia has never been a rule of law society. So Navalny began his activism as a fairly young man. He was in his 20s. In 2000, right? That's the year that Putin becomes president after becoming prime minister in late 99 under Yeltsin. He's a blogger pointing out corruption among the Russian elites. During this time, late 1990s, early 2000s, there was still some room for dissent and criticism of the elites, or no?
There was a lot of space.
Yeah.
In the 1990s, Yeltsin was almost impeached by the parliament.
That's right. Then he turned the cannons on the parliament.
Opposition. Different incidents, but so yes, that was.
I'm getting mixed up with 1993. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, but later, after the war in Chechnya, this was after the first war. This was 97, maybe. There was an attempt, and it came close to impeachment. And one of the articles for impeaching Yeltsin was the war in Chechnya. Look, there has been opposition. We know it's gone very, very badly, but the degree of freedom today versus the 1990s, of course, is incomparable. There was a steady decline, and then in the last few years, there's been a dramatic, terrible decline.
So what was Navalny blogging about in those days?
So I think he was looking for those themes that would resonate with people. He was controversial even back then because it was seen as unsystemic, that he was picking at certain problems as opposed to looking broadly at the system. So, for instance, he had one of his first projects was called Rosyama, Russia's potholes. They would track potholes and how much it costs. He was looking for corruption, and he was looking how to involve people. They would crowdsource photos and conversations about where were the potholes and how much was spent to repair those roads. And you would just see very quickly that what was officially being spent and what was supposedly being done didn't correspond at all with reality. So that's like an early project, but he was incredibly innovative. The creation, what he built, what I want to say is that Navalny leaves behind an example of how a movement can continue under extremely adverse circumstances. So eventually he tried over and over to register a political party, a real opposition party. He couldn't. He won a case in the European Court that he should be registered. He never was. There's a social media movement. There's an investigations arm. There's local projects and like grassroots offices all over the country. So there's interaction with people in real life. And then there's social media, YouTube, Twitter focused.
He mastered
messaging.
that, right? He mastered social media.
He mastered social media. But again, it's not just him. He formed extremely, extremely capable team, because often he was, I'm sorry to say, in jail. So at key moments, they come out, Putin's castle or,
Palace, right?
Palace. Yeah. He was in jail. He was already in jail.
That was the YouTube video, right? With like 1 million views or more?
That had over 100 million views.
100 million, wow.
That had 100 million views. So, and that's pretty late. And YouTube was incredibly powerful in Russia. It still has not been cut off. So YouTube remains as a way of, to your question of how do people organize, YouTube is still there, remarkably, even though some of other social media have been blocked. There's all kinds of blockages of Russian independent media. But YouTube, Telegram, less so Twitter and Facebook, they're just not as popular or as used, but Telegram and YouTube remains available.
I had a friend who once worked at an independent media outlet in Russia, which I believe was shut down relatively recently. And I remember telling her at the time, in all my years as a journalist, that is something I never would have to worry about, never even imagine it. The authorities coming in to shut down where I work, but it did happen to her workplace after she had left, but still she felt terribly about what was going on. Back to Navalny's early years, he formed or he joined a party, the Yabloko Party. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Yabloko. What did this party stand for? Who were its constituents, if you will?
So Yabloko is like a liberal party. It's still out there, especially back then. It was seen as a major conduit, as a democratic force, middle class, urban intelligentsia. At some points, as I was saying before, the sort of distinction between I'm going to stand for certain principles and rights versus I understand the situation my country has put me in. I'm going to make all kinds of compromises. So Yabloko now is seen as kind of having compromised quite a lot to remain an official party, right? And not getting very much in return. But certainly back then, Yabloko was seen as a democratic force.
What about Navalny's politics? During those heady days of the post-Cold War period, before, maybe even during the disastrous Yeltsin years, there was a lot of optimism about Russia moving toward market economy and democracy. Was Navalny a Western-style liberal, lowercase d Democrat? The New York Times obituary pointed out that, some of his views wouldn't sit well with liberals in this country, for instance. His support for gun rights and anti-immigration views. He didn't outright condemn the annexation of Crimea in 2014. That's a little ahead of the period I was just discussing with you, early 2000s, the early Putin years. What were his politics like during those days?
So let me divide this into a couple of different kind of themes. So the first is kind of Navalny's nationalism. So he did flirt. So this period, say, 2008, 2009, heading into, so there were major protests, 2011, 2012. He did flirt with Russian nationalism, but we should be clear what he was doing. It was very much in the anti-imperial line, okay? Was there some language that he later retracted and apologized for? Yes, there was. That Russia pays too much to support ethnic minority republics, which was, sort of in poor taste. However, he let go of that by, say, 2011, 2012, by which point he emerges as the leader of a large, varied opposition movement that had, hundreds of thousands of people on the street. By that point, and certainly since, he becomes a democratic figure, clearly, and separates himself from any of that former rhetoric. And the same goes with Crimea. So I think that is really unfair that has stuck to him. Mm-hmm. He made himself clear. His opposition to the war, Ukraine in 1991, boundaries, that all of this is wrong and has to stop. He has made himself completely clear. And I think on the topic of Ukraine, you can take things that people have said and use it against them forever and just keep raising it. And I think that's what has happened.
Well, what's most important is that he was
some of those things.
Yeah, what's most important was that he was a lowercase d Democrat who wanted to transform his society and have real political pluralism and freedom to state unpopular opinions, which, we take for granted here in the United States. Maybe we shouldn't anymore. But, in the Yeltsin years, there was a debate, maybe the debate's still happening among historians, just how much was Yeltsin, who started out as a radical and you can even call him a separatist. He wanted to separate the Russian Federation from the Soviet Union. How committed was he to democracy? It was always suspected that he just simply wanted to gather authoritarian power for himself. Anyway, there's no evidence that Navalny had any type of authoritarian, leanings, that he wasn't looking just to make himself a new authoritarian leader in Russia.
So this is said about him, and I think that's completely unfair. The idea that Navalny would become an authoritarian leader, that is a Kremlin line, and it's unfortunate to hear that repeated.
I didn't realize that was a Kremlin line, no.
That's very much a Kremlin line. Wow. And you hear it in different contexts. He created a movement of lots of different people. And what was, like you mentioned, gun rights. one of his closest associates was saying that he was being asked this question, and he said, look, we need to get to a point where you can have different parties in Russia. Maybe in that future Russia, Navalny and I might be in different parties. And I've heard people in his movement, many different people say the same thing. There was a libertarian woman. She said, okay, do I love what he's said about migrants? No. Do I love his economic program? No. But with him, we can try to get to the point where he will be in one party and I'll be in my libertarians. Another one of his associates was saying this about gun rights. He was like, I don't necessarily subscribe to the gun rights position, but we need to be together. And then later we can disagree on policy. That's okay.
Yeah.
but let's get as you said, Martin, that we need to get to the point where we can compete.
How did he see Russia changing? He didn't sound like a revolutionary who wanted to topple the regime violently, for instance. What would you call him, a reformer? I mean, what's the mechanism for change at this point?
Elections. The mechanisms are information, so it's organizing. They wanted participation at any cost. When they were denied participation, they showed their influence by showing that they could direct votes. So the Kremlin has all kinds of pocket parties. So it was called Smart Vote. They would poll to understand who might beat the United Russia candidate in any particular jurisdiction, and then use their social capital, their social media, to direct votes to that person. That became too dangerous for the Kremlin because you could clearly see that, like, the candidate, oh my God, some cleaning lady, there was some local official in, I don't remember what region in the last elections. He was running uncontested. So he paid the cleaning lady from the office to run against him just so it would be uncontested. Thanks to Smart Vote, the cleaning lady won. So they proved they were deprived of all ways of showing, of demonstrating their political potential, but they still found ways to do that. And somehow, even in prison above the Arctic Circle, in half his time in solitary confinement, that was still the potential for them exercising influence was too much.
Because there are elections in Russia. The problem is getting them to be free and fair. He did run for mayor of Moscow, won about 25% of the vote, but then he was banned from seeking office because he had been convicted on some trumped-up corruption charges. So, as you said, he tried to get others registered to run for office and to form parties.
There are elections coming up, March 15th to 17th. It's becoming harder and harder for the Kremlin to control the results of elections.
Explain how.
So first, it was, if you take the last 20 years, it was much more that Putin could actually, through his own campaigning, popularity, win. And then it became necessary to, in different ways, not let other forms of competition exist. So now it's 3-day, it's electronic voting. So that creates more and more opportunities for faking it. No one can run. There were 2 people who tried to run who were clear anti-war candidates who had a lot of, again, people came out to support them. People signed their names, even though they understood this could be dangerous. Just that option is not permitted to exist. But the level of control over elections that's needed now to avoid any sense that there could be disagreement.
So in 2020, Navalny was poisoned by the Russian security services. He became very sick on a plane ride from Siberia back to Moscow. He had to go to Germany for treatment to save his life. Why did he go back to Russia knowing he would be arrested?
I had this conversation with Vladimir Putin, who also returned. And why do people return in these circumstances? Because he's a Russian politician. His place is in Russia. The meaning of his life is to try, with whatever the risks. He can't be an opposition leader. He cannot be a real organizer if he's outside. And he can't ask people to take risks if he's not taking risks himself. And he needed to set this example. He remained cheerful. remarkable when you see the political prisoners speaking now. They remain hopeful and cheerful and do everything to show that there's hope and that everyone should be doing the same, that people should be chipping in. It's to attract more people, to show them to not be afraid. And ultimately, it's also his conviction. You have to keep going with your beliefs and that you're on this path, that you can't diverge from it. You've gone too far along that path, and too many of your associates have paid a big price.
What does Navalny's death say about late Putinism? And again, all those hopes and dreams that Russia might be different today.
I have to say, I haven't let go of those dreams. I don't. Some of the people posting after Navalny's death were posting, now we have to do this ourselves. It's up to us. And I think that is the bigger message, that there are lots of people out there who are trying to organize as they can, even now. I don't know how and when and how, but I have not let go of the idea that Russia could be a lot freer and that there's actually much larger proportion of Russians who want political alternatives, see themselves as part of Europe, who see themselves as having been on a democratic trajectory and wanting to return to it. That's a larger part of the population, but it is not given opportunities to organize.
You know, like millions of people around the world, I'm literally both not surprised and outraged by the news. Reported death of Alexei Navalny. He bravely stood up to the corruption, the violence, and all the bad things that the Putin government was doing. In response, Putin had him poisoned, he had him arrested, he had him prosecuted for fabricated crimes, he sentenced him to prison, he was held in isolation. Even all that didn't stop him from calling out Putin's lies. Even in prison, he was a powerful voice for the truth, which is kind of amazing when you think about it. And he could have lived safely in exile after the assassination attempt on him in 2020, which nearly killed him, I might add. But he was traveling outside the country at the time. Instead, he returned to Russia. Knowing he'd likely be imprisoned or even killed if he continued his work. But he did it anyway.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, the first in an occasional series on important American elections, we're going to start with the election of 1980.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.